The central question I want to address in this video is, are anarchists, anti-statists, or members of radical political movements justified in their beliefs about the societies they advocate? What do I mean by this question? I mean, are there sufficiently good reasons such that one can have justified belief that radical societies can plausibly exist more or less as they are imagined? In this video, I shall be arguing that this belief, held by many anarchists, communists, fascists, and other radicals, is unjustified. Since many of my subscribers are anarchists, I imagine this conclusion might make some people upset. However, in light of recent facts, I think I am justified in my belief that all people who adhere to the methodology of radical politics and who believe that their ideal society would resemble its practical implementation are unjustified in their belief. Let me begin by defining what I mean by radical political movements. After this, I will try to explain their methodology. By radical political movements, I mean any school of thought that believes and advocates for a non-existent future society that has never existed before in the past, does not exist now, and which also differs significantly in character from past and present societies. Examples of people who fit this description are anarchists, communists, socialists, and fascists who believe in an ideal society not based on any historical precedents. Exceptions to this definition would be communists and socialists who want to return to historical socialism, such as the USSR, China, or Cuba, and fascists who want to return to historical fascism, as it existed in Nazi Germany and Italy. What is the general methodology radicals used to invent their proposed society? Believe it or not, their methodology is actually rather simple. Radicals start with the question, given the set of values X, what kind of society Y can be imagined such that if Y were implemented, then X would be fulfilled, and not X would be avoided? For anarcho-capitalists in particular, X is often, though not always, the non-aggression principle, whereas not X is some form of aggression. ANCAPs invent an ideal society by trying to imagine what a society that consistently upheld the non-aggression principle would look like. It is obvious that when radicals do such a thing, they are deducing facts from their intuitions to fit a particular set of values, and the facts they deduce purport to describe social behaviors on a massive scale. What about myself? For the past 6 years, I could accurately be described as some kind of radical anarchist. I should mention that when you hear me criticize anarchists and radicals, I consider myself in the company of the guilty. I did political philosophy by deducing the content of my intuition in an imagined thought experiment. In this anarchist thought experiment, I tried to imagine a society that was more or less consistent with my values. As an anarchist, whenever I was met with a potential problem or inconsistency of anarchism, the task then became to modify aspects of the idea to make it seem more consistent. In this way, the whole project essentially was trying to keep a bloated metaphysical thought experiment consistent with my beliefs and values. But enough about me. Let's move on to the argument against anarchism and all other radical political movements. My argument goes as follows. Premise 1. We are justified in believing that non-existent future societies invented through intuitive thought experiments would exist as they are imagined, if and only if there is good reason to believe that human intuition is a reliable guide to large-scale social organization. Premise 2. There is good reason to believe that human intuition is a reliable guide to wide-scale social organization, if and only if the way that radical societies are envisioned is highly analogous to the actual implementation of those societies. Premise 3. The way radical societies are envisioned aren't highly analogous to the actual implementation of those societies. Conclusion. Therefore, we are not justified in believing that non-existent future societies, invented through intuitive thought experiments, would exist as imagined. Let me break down and explain each of these premises. The first premise states, we are justified in believing that radical societies invented through intuitive thought experiments would exist as imagined if and only if there is good reason to believe that human intuition is a reliable guide to wide-scale social organization. Why would this be the case? The reason is because justified belief necessarily requires reliability. If I am justified in my belief that all copper conducts electricity, then such a belief must be reliable. In other words, it must be the case that many instances of copper are consistently observed conducting electricity. If copper was observed to generally not conduct electricity, then we would say that my belief that all copper conducts electricity is unjustified because it is not reliable. The second premise states, there is good reason to believe that human intuition is a reliable guide to wide-scale social organization if and only if the way radical societies are envisioned happen to be highly analogous to the actual implementation of those societies. This premise seems fairly straightforward. It essentially states that the necessary and sufficient conditions for the reliability of non-existent future societies that emerge from human intuition are high levels of similarity between the imagined society and the actual implementation of such a society. If there is a strong dissimilarity between the proposed society and the actual society, then we really can't say that such a belief is reliable at all. Imagine a radical who created a thought experiment about a non-existent future society with full employment. Imagine this radical wholeheartedly believed that if such a society was implemented, it would have full employment. Now imagine that every time this society was implemented, it possessed a nearly 50% unemployment rate. This would be a huge difference between how society was supposed to be and how it actually is. If this happened, we would say that the radicals' intuitive belief was an unreliable guide to large-scale social behaviors. The third and final premise states, non-existent future societies are envisioned in a way that is not highly analogous to the actual implementation of such societies. One might wonder why the practical implementation of ideal societies doesn't resemble the ideal. One might also wonder what actual evidence supports this view. To address the first question, the answer is simple. The scope of the environmental, cultural, and biological variables in society is so vast as to be beyond comprehension. There are billions upon billions of variables. We cannot even imagine or comprehend a million men walking together in a single direction, a very simple pattern, let alone hundreds of millions of people interacting in complex and not well understood ways. Inevitably, when we use our intuitions to create an ideal society, we are creating a highly simplified and empirically untested model of human behavior which could never fully capture the true complexity of the millions of cultural, biological, and environmental variables that pervade the functioning of society. Also, if we examine the empirical evidence for the levels of similarity between ideal societies proposed throughout history and their attempted implementation, we see huge amounts of dissimilarity. The reality is so horribly deformed and unanalogous that it appears to be little more than a crude caricature of the idealized supposition. But what's the real evidence? We can start our investigation by looking at the history of attempts organizing utopian socialist communes in North America between 1800 and 1900. During this period, there were no fewer than 25 major attempts to create utopian socialist societies. Utopian socialism was a radical political movement whose proponents used their intuitions to deduce many facts about human society and human behavior. One of the views that proponents intuited was the idea that human nature was fundamentally plastic. Adherents to this view of socialism also believed that men and women could be made voluntarily to live in harmonious societies where individuals would rise above petty self-interest to work for the good of all. Compensation was to follow the maxim of equality. Everyone would essentially be paid the same wage. Private property would be abolished, and all property would be held in common. Proponents of utopian socialism believed that the implementation of their society would lead to a more rational and technologically advanced society with more overall wealth for all. Sadly for the socialists, however, every single attempt to create a utopian socialist-style commune in North America either resulted in total economic failure and bankruptcy or outright incorporation, i.e., the more successful of the communes totally abandoned their egalitarian and socialist roots and became profit-seeking corporations. It is no stretch to say that the total economic failure or outright abandonment of socialism in 25 major experimental iterations of utopian socialism is a massive dissimilarity between the rosy suppositions of utopian socialism and the actual reality of implementing the ideas. To see further evidence of the unreliability of our intuitions, we can look at the history of Marxism. Now Marx, contrasting the utopian socialist, envisioned socialism as a society under the dictatorship of the proletariat. The proletariat was imagined to rise up and seize the means of production and the state during a class struggle. The proletariat under socialism would then use their newfound power to root out and destroy the capitalist relics, and to reorganize society to be run by and for the workers. The workers would supposedly run society in accordance with a maxim from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Marx also predicted a crisis of capitalism in which the ranks of the proletariat would swell as capitalist exploitation and the progression of technology, men being replaced by machines, created unemployment. A worldwide class war would emerge between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, in which the proletariat would triumph, and thus would begin the inevitable transition from global capitalism to global socialism, and then from socialism to communism, in accordance with the supposed ironclad materialist laws of history. Communism would be a technologically advanced, classless society in which there was to be a superabundance of everything, so that every member of the society would have the freedom to work at his or her own leisure. Now, in every recorded communist experiment, the reality was nearly the exact opposite of what Marx envisioned. There was no crisis of capitalism, no workers' rebellion. There was no total global transition from capitalism to socialism, just the opposite, in fact. Furthermore, in the communist countries that did emerge, USSR, China, Cuba, etc., there was no classless society. A wealthy elite bureaucratic class, often referred to as the nomenklatura in the Eastern Bloc, emerged and dominated both the state and the proletariat. So much for the proletarian dictatorship. There was also no superabundance of goods and no superb technological progression either. Communist countries were notorious for lagging far behind their Western capitalist counterparts in both these areas. Moreover, with the possible exception of North Korea, all communist governments throughout history have either failed in transition to capitalism or have compromised socialism by implementing severe market reforms, abolishing most price controls, and privatizing large swaths of state industry. If that doesn't convince you, we can look at a fundamental a priori supposition of economics that has pervaded the discipline for much of the 20th century. This evidence further supports the third premise, that our intuitions are not a reliable guide to human social organization. The idea in question is the concept of homo economicus, or perfectly rational actors. This essentially was a view of human nature that characterized all humans as fundamentally rational beings who consistently pursue their own self-interest by always seeking to maximize their own individual utility. We now know that this view of human nature is incorrect. We know from laboratory experiments and common sense observation that humans are not perfectly rational utility-maximizing beings. First, it has been shown experimentally that humans let irrelevant information interfere with and influence their utility calculations. Furthermore, there have also been experiments demonstrating that human beings freely make choices that do not lead to their best expected payoff. It should be obvious that neither of these facts is consistent with the idea that humans are perfectly rational. Finally, we can look to the history of anarchist experiments to support this idea. There are exactly 3 very large-scale experiments that are generally thought of as being largely anarchistic in character that occurred throughout history. These are the Paris Commune, the Menkevistas in the Ukraine during the Russian Revolution, and the anarchists in Catalina and Barcelona during the Spanish Civil War. All 3 experiments were crushed by a superior military force. All 3 were plagued by rampant inflation, negative GDP growth, high unemployment, and large numbers of people injured or killed. Now obviously, a society crushed by force, which has rampant inflation, economic recession, high employment, and widespread death, is not what anarchists envision in their ideal society. Now to be fair, many of these unfortunate facts were caused by confounding variables. For instance, every single example was also a civil war. However, this still means that there was a high level of dissimilarity between the imagined society and the reality. It also means that there is virtually no positive evidence for the superior benefits of such a society. Radical political philosophy takes an a priorist view of politics. They start with the values they want to see realized and proceed to build a mental model that seems to fulfill these values. I think this is absolutely the wrong way to do political philosophy. A truly scientific or analytic view of political philosophy would do just the opposite. They would use induction and not deduction. A good scientist or wise analytic philosopher would begin by saying, given the set of values X, what kind of society has existed in the past, such that we can draw the inference that implementing Y would fulfill X and avoid not X, given that Y has done so in the past. This is the way I think political philosophy ought to be done. This is essentially the way we do science. Why should politics be special? Another good example that is largely, but not totally, analogous to the radical political movements is the history of Futurism. Like radicals, Futurists try to predict what a future society would look like by relying on their intuitions. Now to clarify, I'm not talking about industry insiders who make inductive predictions based on data. For example, a software engineer working on a basic voice recognition software program in the early 90s who predicts that within 20 years that there will be voice recognition software able to recognize slow, clear human speech. This is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about predictions largely based on mental models, which are not really based on data. There are a long history of failed, intuitive futurist predictions about society. Here are a few examples of predictions that have obviously failed. In 1977, Ken Olsen, the president, chairman, and founder of Digital Equipment Corporation, said, quote, "There is no reason anyone would want a computer in their home." In 1989, Bill Gates, the former CEO and founder of Microsoft, said, quote, "We will never make a 32-bit operating system." In 1920, the New York Times said, quote, a rocket will never be able to leave the Earth's atmosphere. Robert McCallum, an American physicist and Nobel Prize winner in 1923, said, quote, "No scientific bad boy will ever be able to blow up the world by releasing atomic energy." Lord Kelvin, a world-renowned mathematical physicist and engineer, and the inventor of the Kelvin scale, said in 1899, quote, "X-rays will prove to be a hoax." In 1974, 5 years before she became Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher said, "It will be years, not in my time, before a woman will become Prime Minister." Right before the stock market crash of 1929, Irving Fisher, a professor of economics at Yale University, said, quote, "Stocks have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau." In the year 2000, Congressman Ron Paul said, "We can soon expect a major downward correction in the housing industry, prompted by rising interest rates." As we now know, the crash didn't come until 8 years later and was marked by record low interest rates. Alex Lewitt, a president of the vacuum cleaner company Lewitt Corp., told the New York Times in 1955, "Nuclear-powered vacuum cleaners will probably be a reality in 10 years. Renowned British journalist and author John Davies said in 1936, quote, "Democracy will be dead by 1950. Just before the start of World War II, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain said, "For the second time in our history, a British Prime Minister has returned from Germany bringing peace with honor. I believe it is a peace for our time." If this doesn't convince you that our intuitions are unreliable guides, let me provide a final example. This narrative comes from Carl Menger in his 1892 journal article titled "On the Origin of Money." Menger's explanation has become the orthodox economic explanation for the origins of money. If you read any introductory textbook to economics, you will undoubtedly find a chapter on the origin of money directly inspired by Menger. Menger in economics tells us that before the onset of currency, all primitive human societies began as barter economies. They argue that these primitive economies experienced a market inefficiency known as the problem of the double coincidence of wants. The argument goes like this. For two people to voluntarily trade through barter, both parties must, by coincidence, want what the other has. If one party does not want what the other has, then trade cannot occur. This means that if I have something you want, but I don't want what you have to trade me, then you will have to find someone else to trade for an item that I want, before you can then trade me for what you want. This inefficiency of barter drastically increases transaction costs. It means that even simple trades in barter economies can potentially require dozens of costly transactions. Menger argues that currency economies emerged after barter economies to solve this problem. Currency is a medium of exchange. The value of all goods can be measured in terms of currency. Thus, currency allows people to exchange diverse goods directly, which allows us to overcome the problem of the double coincidence of wants. Menger's argument is highly convincing. I was convinced of it at myself one point. There is just one problem with the argument. Menger's argument was based purely on his intuitions about what he thought primitive societies must have looked like. Menger and economists who argue this point literally have no empirical evidence to support the idea that human societies began as barter economies and then transitioned to money-based economies. Caroline Humphreys, a professor of anthropology at Cambridge, describes the lack of evidence as follows, quote, "No example of a barter economy, pure and simple, has ever been described, let alone the emergence from it of money. All available ethnography suggests that there has never been such a thing. Moreover, the anthropological evidence suggests the exact opposite. It turns out that human societies started as primitive hunter-gatherer societies. The evidence suggests that those early human societies had gift economies based on collective ownership and reciprocity, and did not have barter economies. Thus, again, the evidence suggests that our intuitions are not reliable guides to the massive social organization of persons. If you are still not convinced, I have 5 additional arguments against radical political philosophy and its method of deducing facts from an imagined society. These arguments shall be framed in terms of 5 problems. The first problem is the fallacy of wishful moral thinking. There are many people who accept anarchism or are a part of some other radical political movement for moral reasons. For instance, somebody might be an anarchist because they believe that this kind of society is the best or perhaps the only moral society. People like this implicitly or explicitly believe that anarchism isn't some fantasy or delusion, but has the very real possibility of being implemented. Such a view is problematic, however. This is because it is essentially the fallacy of wishful thinking. It does not follow from the fact that Y believes, desires, or wishes X, that X will therefore occur. Christians in particular believe that homosexuality is immoral, yet it exists. They also believe that it is moral to give to charity, but yet many people don't. Likewise, it doesn't follow from the fact that anarchism, or some other radical political system, is supposedly the most moral system, that it therefore can be realized practically. The second problem I shall call the problem of false analogies. To bolster the legitimacy of their claimed societies, radicals often reference historical examples of their proposed society. Anarcho-capitalists in particular are often fond of referencing medieval Ireland and medieval Iceland as examples of the kind of society they propose. Now, first of all, the claim that any of these societies was ever stateless, or anarchist, or polycentrist is highly dubious to begin with. Medieval Ireland actually had a king, and medieval Iceland had hereditary elites that had the power to compel military service. Furthermore, medieval Iceland's court system contained a court known as the Fifth Court, which had the power to overrule all other courts. Many people consider anarchism to imply polycentric law. However, this is clearly an example of monocentric law. But even if we ignore these inconvenient details, there is still a problem. Anarchists, who are by no means the only radicals that do this, use medieval Ireland and Iceland as an analogy. Many anarchists claim that anarchism, or polycentric law, could reasonably be expected to exist in the future, because the future could be like the past examples of medieval Ireland and medieval Iceland. The problem with this is comparing a medieval society to any modern society would be completely unanalogous. Let us compare the analogs of the current United States with medieval Ireland and Iceland. The United States, constitutional republic, modern industrial economy, enforces judicial decisions, highly connected, highly interdependent, technologically advanced, large diverse population, secular government, secular culture, comparatively wealthy, modern culture, large educated population, service economy, large military, bans on slavery. This is completely different from medieval Ireland and Iceland. Medieval Ireland and Iceland, monarchy/federation of elites, primitive agrarian economy, didn't enforce judicial decisions, highly isolated, self-sufficient, technologically primitive, small homogeneous population, religious culture, religious government, comparatively poor, primitive culture, uneducated population, subsistence agricultural economy, small military, permit slavery. As we can see, it would be erroneous to infer that because so-called anarchist medieval Iceland and Ireland existed in the past, that anarchism or polycentric law could exist in a future post-industrial society. This is because the two situations are absolutely not analogous, as many different relevant things are true of them. So the analogy is false and the conclusions are unwarranted. By contrast, social anarchists often point to the examples of the Paris Commune and the Spanish Civil War as examples of anarchism. They claim that social anarchism could reasonably be expected to exist in the future because it has existed in the past. However, this view is extremely problematic. Presumably, anarchists don't think that their society, if implemented, would be quickly crushed by force. However, virtually all anarchist experiments were hastily destroyed and crushed by force, including both the Paris Commune and the Spanish Civil War. Therefore, this analogy is false because it extrapolates something in the past which never occurred, i.e., not being crushed, onto the future. In addition to this problem, there is a related problem I like to call the impotent analogy problem. The problem goes like this. Members of radical political movements want to significantly change the status quo. The only reason radicals want to change the status quo is because they believe that there are other forms of social and economic organization that offer significantly greater benefits relative to the status quo. Things like more economic growth, more social cohesion, less crime, a greater level of happiness, less pollution, etc. Why is this problematic? This is problematic because to justify the idea that non-existent future societies would be better than the status quo, radical political movements use historical examples. Anarchists use medieval Ireland, medieval Iceland, the Paris Commune, the Spanish Civil War. Fascists use Nazi Germany and Italy, and communists and socialists use the USSR, China, and Cuba. But what's wrong with these examples as analogies? In addition to the fact that these examples are from a completely different era, not one of these examples had a higher standard of living than first world countries at the time or today. There is no evidence that medieval Ireland or Iceland generally had a better standard of living than other European states. Furthermore, if we look at states from the same period, there is good evidence that the Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, had a significantly higher standard of living than either Ireland or Iceland. If we look at the Paris Commune, we see massive inflation, class warfare, and eventually the murder of tens of thousands of communards who participated in the experiment. In the Spanish Civil War, we saw 500,000 soldiers and civilians killed. Spain experienced hyperinflation, massive unemployment, the destruction of its economy, rampant disease, and the utter obliteration of many homes, businesses, and cities. The USSR and Communist China experienced repeated famines. Several million people died in famines in the Ukraine, and over 40 million people died from famine and mismanagement that occurred during Mao's Great Leap Forward in Communist China. Furthermore, China, the USSR, and Cuba experienced lower rates of economic growth, pitifully lackluster per capita GDP, and an extremely low standard of living for its citizens relative to other liberal democracies and constitutional republics. If we look at fascist states like Nazi Germany and Italy, we see that during the entirety of their existence, both states experienced average yearly GDP growth that was negative. Furthermore, both states were the instigators of World War II, which caused the near total destruction of Europe. Untold millions of Germans and Italians were brutalized and killed because of the policies of these fascist regimes. Plus, both countries were entirely destroyed in the process. Thus, all of these historical examples do not seem prima facie to afford any significant benefit over the status quo. Not one of these examples demonstrates a superior quality of life relative to first world states existing at the same time period. This is why I call these analogies impotent, because they extrapolate a kind of past success which never actually occurred onto the future. Thus, not only are these analogies false, but they're also highly unimpressive. Lastly, radical political movements can be successfully argued against with the principle of parsimony, also known as Occam's razor. The principle states that when two theories explain something equally well, the theory that makes the fewest number of assumptions is probably correct. This is because the theory with the fewest number of assumptions has the smallest probability that any of those assumptions will be false. The more assumptions a theory has, the greater the likelihood that one of those assumptions will be false. Radical political movements are notorious for relying on large numbers of assumptions. Not only do these movements rely on huge numbers of assumptions, but all of these assumptions are completely untested, and it's really just pure speculation on the part of the radicals themselves. Because I'm more familiar with anarchism, let me focus on anarchism. To assume an anarchist society might plausibly exist in the future, we need to assume a large number of primary assumptions and untold thousands of secondary assumptions. To assume that anarchism can plausibly exist in a way that is better than the status quo, i.e. the United States, we at very least have to assume the following list of primary assumptions. 1. The free rider problem of national defense will somehow have to be overcome. 2. Hostile neighboring states will somehow be prevented from invading. 3. Polycentric legal agencies will generally cooperate with each other. 4. Polycentric legal agencies will uphold a consistent set of property norms. 5. Polycentric legal agencies will be able to implement laws that overcome collective action problems such as roads, the tragedy of the commons, fire protection, pollution, control of the airwaves, etc. 6. Polycentric legal agencies will agree and enforce laws that incentivize innovation, i.e. addresses the issues of intellectual property, trademarks, and patents. 7. Polycentric legal agencies will not systematically fall into conflicts with one another. 8. Anarchism will grant people a higher life expectancy. 9. Anarchism will grant people more per capita income. 10. Anarchism will experience less pollution. 11. Anarchism will grant people a higher level of happiness. 12. Anarchism will lead to less crime. 13. A state will be prevented from emerging within the stateless territory. 14. The nuclear arsenal of the U.S. will not be used to destroy or threaten the newly emerged anarchist society or its neighbors. 15. There will not be a massive worldwide trade embargo against the anarchists. Now, with just one primary assumption, I can argue that anarchism cannot plausibly exist in the future. I can do this simply by assuming newly emerged anarchist societies will be invaded and crushed by hostile states. This assumption seems especially reasonable, as 3 large anarchist experiments have been destroyed by hostile states with superior militaries. The Paris Commune was destroyed by the French army. Nestor Menko and the anarchists in the Ukraine were crushed by the Red Army, and the anarchists in the Spanish Civil War were crushed by the combined armies of Francisco Franco, Nazi Germany, and Italy. Now, the principle of parsimony tells us that the theory that makes the smallest number of assumptions is probably correct. Since a theory against anarchism or radical politics can assume just one primary assumption, and since anarchism requires no less than 15 primary assumptions, the theory that anarchism cannot exist in the future is more likely to be true. Now, the principle of parsimony doesn't merely deflate anarchism, it deflates all radical political movements. The theories that all of these movements rely on have dozens of primary assumptions and thousands of secondary assumptions. There are very few ways for these theories to go right, but plenty of ways for them to go wrong. Thus, parsimony dictates that radical politics is probably a pipe dream best relegated to the dustbin of history.